The rain was coming down hard that November night. Victoria Ashford sat in the back of her car, scrolling through her phone as her driver navigated the slick city streets. She had just left a charity event at the Grand View Hotel, one of those fancy gatherings where wealthy people wrote checks and felt good about themselves. Victoria wasn't like most of them, though. She had built her fortune from nothing, starting a tech company in her garage 12 years ago and turning it into a multi-million-dollar success. At 42, she was at the top of her game. Her company was thriving. She had more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes, and she was finally feeling like all those years of struggle had been worth it. She was texting her younger sister, Elena, telling her about the boring speeches at the gala, when everything changed in an instant. The truck came out of nowhere. Her driver didn't even have time to honk. The sound of metal crunching against metal was the last thing Victoria heard before her world went dark. The impact sent her car spinning across 2 lanes before it slammed into a concrete barrier. Emergency sirens filled the night air within minutes, but for Victoria, there was only silence. At City Memorial Hospital, the trauma team worked frantically to save her life. Victoria had suffered severe head injuries, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. They managed to stabilize her body, but her brain was a different story. The swelling was massive and the damage was extensive. After emergency surgery, the doctors gave her family the news nobody wants to hear. Victoria was in a coma and her chances of waking up were slim to none. Elena was devastated. She was only 35, and Victoria was more than just her sister. She was her best friend, her mentor, and the person who had helped raise her after their parents died. Now, watching Victoria lying motionless in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, Elena felt completely lost. Dr. Ryan Torres was the young neurologist who walked into Victoria's room 3 days after the accident. At 29, he was one of the newest additions to the hospital's neurology department, fresh from completing his residency at a top program in Boston. He had kind eyes and a calm demeanor that made families feel a little less afraid, even in the worst situations. Ryan studied Victoria's charts carefully, reviewing the brain scans and test results. The other doctors had already written her off. In their weekly meetings, they talked about Victoria's case with a certain finality, suggesting that the family should consider their options regarding life support. 6 months was the timeline they threw around. If she didn't show improvement by then, well, it was probably time to let her go. But Ryan saw something different. Maybe it was because he was young and still believed in possibilities. Or maybe it was because he had spent his entire residency studying cases just like this one. Whatever the reason, when he looked at Victoria's brain activity monitors, he noticed tiny patterns that everyone else had dismissed as random noise. They were faint, barely there, but they were consistent. It wasn't much, but it was something. He started spending extra time in Victoria's room. At first, it was just to run additional tests, to confirm what he was seeing in the data, but soon he found himself talking to her. The research was clear that coma patients could sometimes hear and process information, even when they couldn't respond. So Ryan talked. He told her about the weather, about hospital gossip, about the news. He felt a bit foolish at first, having conversations with someone who couldn't answer back, but he kept doing it anyway. Elena noticed him during one of her daily visits. She had been sitting with Victoria for hours, holding her sister's hand and crying softly, when Ryan came in for evening rounds. He didn't just check the monitors and leave like the other doctors. He pulled up a chair and asked Elena about Victoria. What kind of person was she? What did she like? What made her laugh? Elena found herself talking about her sister for the first time since the accident, really talking about her. She told Ryan about how Victoria loved classical music, especially Chopin, how she was obsessed with technology and innovation, how she could be tough as nails in the boardroom but would cry at sad movies, how she had worked herself to the bone to build her company because she wanted to prove that a woman from a poor neighborhood could make it big. Ryan listened to everything, taking mental notes. The next day, Elena arrived to find classical music playing softly in Victoria's room. Ryan had brought in a small speaker and set up a playlist. He explained that auditory stimulation could potentially help with brain function, and if Victoria loved music, it might reach her in ways that medical treatment couldn't. Over the following weeks, Ryan became a constant presence in Victoria's life, or what was left of it. He implemented a treatment plan that had other doctors shaking their heads. He brought in different textures for tactile stimulation, varying the music selections, adjusting the lighting in her room to mimic natural day and night cycles. He even started reading news about the tech industry to her, figuring that her passion for technology might spark something in her brain. The hospital staff thought he was wasting his time. Nurses would whisper about the young doctor who was too idealistic, who hadn't learned yet that some patients just don't come back. His colleagues suggested, politely at first and then more directly, that he was getting too emotionally invested. But Ryan couldn't let it go. Every time he looked at Victoria's brain activity, he saw those tiny fluctuations that told him someone was still in there, fighting to get out. 6 months passed, the deadline that the medical team had set. There was a meeting scheduled to discuss Victoria's care, and everyone knew what that meant. Elena came to the hospital that morning, feeling like she was going to be sick. She loved her sister, but keeping her alive on machines, was that really what Victoria would have wanted? She didn't know anymore. Ryan found her in the hospital chapel, crying. He sat down beside her and said something that changed everything. He told her he understood this was impossibly hard, but he believed Victoria could still recover. He showed her the data, the tiny improvements that nobody else was tracking. They were small, so small that they were barely measurable, but they were there. He asked Elena for more time. Not forever, just more time. Elena looked at this young doctor who barely knew her sister, who had no reason to care this much about one patient among hundreds, and she saw something in his eyes: determination, hope, belief. She agreed to wait, to give Victoria more time. The other doctors weren't happy, but Elena was Victoria's medical proxy, and the decision was hers to make. So the vigil continued. Ryan kept coming every day, kept talking to Victoria, kept believing when everyone else had given up. He would sit beside her bed during his breaks, telling her about his day, about funny things that happened in the hospital, about his own life. He told her she needed to wake up because her sister needed her, because her company needed her, because the world needed people like her who refused to quit. And somewhere in the darkness where Victoria existed, maybe, just maybe, she could hear him. 3 years is a long time to wait for a miracle, but sometimes miracles take their time. 3 years and 4 months. That's how long Victoria had been lying in that hospital bed when it happened. Ryan was doing his usual routine, checking her vitals and talking to her about the morning news. He was telling her about some new smartphone that had just been released, thinking she might find it interesting given her background in tech. He was adjusting her pillow when he felt it. A movement so slight that he almost thought he had imagined it. Victoria's fingers had twitched. Just barely, just for a second, but they had moved. Ryan's heart started pounding. He immediately checked all the monitors, looking for any changes in her brain activity. Then he gently took her hand and spoke to her, his voice urgent but calm. "Victoria, if you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." Nothing happened. Ryan waited, barely breathing. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was just a muscle spasm, something that meant nothing. But then, after what felt like forever, her fingers moved again. This time he was sure. He called for the nursing staff, trying to keep his excitement under control. They ran tests, lots of tests. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria showed more signs of emerging from the coma. Her eyes would flutter during certain stimulations. Her heart rate would change when Elena spoke to her. Small things, but after 3 years of nothing, these small things felt like miracles. The hospital was buzzing with the news. The woman who everyone had given up on was showing signs of waking up. Elena practically lived at the hospital during those 2 weeks, afraid to leave in case she missed something important. Ryan was there every spare moment he had, monitoring every tiny change, documenting everything. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early March, Victoria opened her eyes. Elena was reading to her from a book when it happened. She looked up and found her sister staring at her, confusion and fear written all over her face. Elena screamed for the nurses, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at the same time. Ryan rushed in within minutes. He had been in a meeting but dropped everything when he got the page. When he walked into that room and saw Victoria's eyes open, really open, and aware, he felt something break loose in his chest. 3 years of hoping, of believing, of refusing to give up, and here she was, actually awake. But waking up from a 3-year coma isn't like waking up from a normal sleep. Victoria couldn't talk at first. Her throat was damaged from the breathing tube and her vocal cords needed time to recover. She couldn't move her body the way she wanted to. Her muscles had withered away from lack of use, and even lifting her hand felt like an impossible task. And her mind, well, her mind was struggling to make sense of everything. Imagine going to sleep one night and waking up 3 years later. The world has moved on without you. Technology has changed. People have changed. Your entire life has been packed away and redistributed. That was Victoria's reality. Ryan was there for all of it. When she finally managed to speak her first word, a raspy water that took enormous effort, he was the one holding the cup to her lips. When she spoke her first full sentence asking, "Where am I?" in a voice filled with confusion and fear, he was the one who gently explained what had happened to her. The hardest conversation came a few days later, when Victoria was alert enough to understand everything. Ryan and Elena sat with her and told her the truth. 3 years had passed. Her company had been sold by the board of directors after a year of her being in a coma. Her beautiful penthouse apartment had been sublet to help cover medical expenses. Most of her friends had slowly stopped visiting after the first year, moving on with their lives like people do. Victoria took the news quietly, but Ryan could see the devastation in her eyes. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built was gone. She was 45 years old and she had to start over from scratch. Except this time she was starting over in a body that didn't work properly and a world she didn't recognize. The physical therapy was brutal. Victoria had been an independent, successful woman who ran a company and made million-dollar decisions. Now she couldn't even sit up without help. She couldn't walk. She couldn't feed herself. Every small task required assistance, and for someone like Victoria, that was almost harder than the physical pain. Ryan accompanied her to many of her therapy sessions. Even though it wasn't technically part of his job anymore, he encouraged her when she wanted to give up. He celebrated with her when she managed to grip a spoon or take a few steps with a walker. He made her laugh when she was crying from frustration, telling her terrible jokes that weren't even funny, but somehow they made her smile anyway. During the long hours of rehabilitation, Victoria started piecing together the story of her coma years. The nurses told her about the young doctor who had fought for her when everyone else had given up. Elena told her about how Ryan had spent countless hours researching her condition, trying experimental therapies that the hospital didn't even officially approve, how he had used his own money to buy books and music for her room, how he had talked to her every single day for 3 years. Victoria found herself watching Ryan whenever he was in the room. The way he moved, confident but gentle, the way he spoke to her, never talking down to her like she was broken but treating her like the intelligent person she was, the way his face lit up when she made progress like her victories were his victories too. She started looking forward to his rounds. Her heart would beat a little faster when she heard his voice in the hallway. She would save up funny comments or observations to share with him, just to see him smile, and slowly, carefully, she realized something that both excited and terrified her. She was developing feelings for him. It didn't make sense, she told herself. He was her doctor. He was 13 years younger than her. He was probably just being kind because that was his job. But her heart didn't care about logic. Every time he held her arm to help her walk, every time he celebrated her small victories like they were huge achievements, every time he looked at her with those kind eyes, she fell a little bit more. Ryan, for his part, was starting to struggle with his own feelings. He had been professionally invested in Victoria's recovery. Sure, but somewhere along the way it had become more than that. He found himself thinking about her when he wasn't at work. He looked forward to seeing her more than he should. He had started noticing things that had nothing to do with her medical condition, like the way she laughed at his jokes or how her eyes sparkled when she got excited about something. It scared him. He was her doctor. There were rules, professional boundaries that existed for good reasons. He couldn't have feelings for a patient. It was unethical. It was wrong. It could cost him his career, so Ryan started pulling back. He began sending other doctors to check on Victoria instead of going himself. He made his visits shorter, more clinical, more distant. He stopped sharing personal stories and kept conversations strictly about her medical progress. Victoria noticed immediately. The warmth that had been there was gone, replaced by professional politeness. Ryan barely looked at her anymore. He didn't celebrate her progress the way he used to. It was like a light had been switched off and Victoria didn't understand why. She thought maybe she had done something wrong. Maybe she had been too demanding, too difficult. Or maybe the worst thought of all, maybe he had only been kind because she was an interesting medical case, and now that she was recovering, she wasn't interesting anymore. The change affected her recovery. Her progress slowed. She became quieter during therapy sessions. The spark that had been returning to her eyes started to dim again. Even Elena noticed something was wrong, but when she asked, Victoria just said she was tired. One afternoon, Elena confronted Ryan in the hallway. She had seen the way her sister's mood had changed, and she had her suspicions about why. She asked him directly what was going on, why he had suddenly become so distant. Ryan tried to deflect, saying he was just busy, that other doctors were perfectly capable of handling Victoria's care. But Elena wasn't buying it. She pushed harder, and finally Ryan admitted the truth. He had feelings for Victoria. Feelings that were inappropriate and unprofessional. Feelings that made it impossible for him to continue as her doctor. So he was doing the right thing by stepping back. What Ryan didn't know was that Victoria had followed her sister into the hallway, using her walker. She had been looking for Elena, and had arrived just in time to hear the entire conversation. She stood there, hidden around the corner, listening to Ryan confess that he cared about her, that he had feelings for her, but that he couldn't act on them because it would be wrong. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since waking up, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of relief. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't imagined the connection between them. He felt it too. But as she stood there listening to Ryan explain all the reasons why they couldn't be together, her heart broke a little. Because even though he cared about her, even though she cared about him, the world and its rules stood between them. And for the second time in 3 years, Victoria felt completely helpless. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ryan's words over and over in her mind. He had feelings for her, real feelings. But he was walking away because he thought it was the right thing to do. Part of her understood. She had been his patient for over 3 years. There were rules about these things, boundaries that doctors weren't supposed to cross, but another part of her, the part that had just woken up to discover her entire life had been erased, wanted to scream that life was too short for rules. She had lost 3 years. She wasn't going to lose this too, but what if her feelings weren't even real? That question haunted her as the days passed. She had read about things like this during her recovery. Patients who fell for their doctors. There was even a name for it. Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding, hero worship. Maybe she was just confused. Maybe her brain was playing tricks on her, making her think she loved Ryan when really she was just grateful to him. The thought made her feel sick. She didn't want to be that person, the vulnerable patient who misunderstood kindness for something more. She had always been so strong, so certain of herself. Now she couldn't even trust her own feelings. Ryan's absence made everything worse. A different doctor took over her care. A pleasant woman named Dr. Patterson who was perfectly nice but wasn't Ryan. Victoria found herself looking at the door every time it opened, hoping to see him walk in. But he never did. Or when he did, it was just for a moment. A quick check-in that was so formal and distant that it hurt more than if he hadn't come at all. Her physical therapy continued. But Victoria's heart wasn't in it anymore. She went through the motions, did the exercises, but the fire that had been driving her recovery seemed to have gone out. Her therapist noticed. Elena noticed. Even the nurses noticed. But nobody knew how to help her because Victoria wouldn't talk about what was really wrong. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she had overheard Ryan's confession, Victoria had a breakthrough of a different kind. She was in the therapy room, struggling with a walking exercise when she suddenly got angry. Really, truly angry. She was angry at the driver who had hit her car. Angry at her body for being so weak. Angry at the world for moving on without her. But most of all, she was angry at herself for letting her emotions control her recovery. She had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. She had fought her way out of poverty and proved everyone wrong who said she couldn't make it. And now she was falling apart because of a man? No, that wasn't who she was. Victoria threw herself back into her recovery with a determination that surprised everyone. She pushed harder in physical therapy. She started working with a speech therapist to strengthen her voice. She began doing cognitive exercises to sharpen her mind. If Ryan didn't want to be with her because of professional ethics, fine. But she wasn't going to fall apart. She was going to get better. get stronger, and prove to herself that she didn't need anyone to save her. Weeks turned into months. Victoria's progress was remarkable. She went from using a walker to using a cane. Then she started taking steps without any assistance at all. Her doctors were amazed at her determination. Elena was relieved to see her sister fighting again, but inside Victoria was still hurting. She just got better at hiding it. Ryan watched from a distance, and it was torture. He saw her progress in the medical charts, heard about her improvements from the other doctors, and occasionally caught glimpses of her in the hallways. Each time he saw her, she looked stronger, more like the successful woman she had been before the accident. And each time he felt the loss of what could have been, he tried dating other people. There was a nurse from the pediatric ward who had been asking him out for months. He finally said yes, and they went to dinner a few times. She was sweet and funny, and under normal circumstances he probably would have liked her. But every conversation felt flat. Every laugh felt forced, because she wasn't Victoria. He tried throwing himself into his work, taking on extra shifts, volunteering for the most challenging cases. But nothing could fill the empty space that Victoria had left in his life. His colleagues started worrying about him. He looked tired all the time, distracted. The brilliant young doctor who had been so passionate about his work now seemed to be just going through the motions. One evening, Ryan attended a medical conference at a hotel downtown. He wasn't particularly interested in going, but his supervisor had insisted. During one of the sessions, a bioethicist gave a presentation about doctor-patient relationships and professional boundaries. Ryan sat up and paid attention, hoping to find confirmation that he had made the right choice by distancing himself from Victoria. But what the speaker said surprised him. Yes, there were rules about doctors and patients being in relationships. Those rules existed for good reasons, to protect vulnerable patients from being taken advantage of. But the speaker explained that context mattered. Once a doctor-patient relationship had formally ended, once sufficient time had passed, and once both people were on equal footing, a relationship wasn't automatically unethical. The key word was vulnerable. The rules were meant to protect patients who were dependent on their doctors, who couldn't make free choices because of their medical situation. But what about when that was no longer the case? What about when the patient had recovered, moved on, and was living independently? What about when enough time had passed that the power dynamic had shifted? Ryan left that conference with his mind spinning. Had he been wrong? Had he walked away from Victoria based on a misunderstanding of the rules? Or worse, had he used the rules as an excuse because he was scared? Meanwhile, Victoria was preparing for a huge step. 6 months after waking from her coma, she was being discharged from the rehabilitation facility. She had found a new apartment, one with accessibility features she still needed, but also space for her to rebuild her life. Elena had helped her set everything up, and Victoria was both excited and terrified about living independently again. On her last day at the facility, Victoria sat in her room, packing the few belongings she had accumulated. There was a knock at the door, and her heart jumped, hoping it might be Ryan coming to say goodbye. But it was Dr. Patterson, her current physician, coming to do final discharge paperwork. As Dr. Patterson reviewed her medications and follow-up appointments, Victoria asked a question that had been bothering her. Whatever happened to Dr. Torres? I haven't seen him around much lately. Dr. Patterson smiled knowingly. Oh, he's still here. He's actually been following your case very closely, just from a distance. He asks about you all the time. She paused, seeming to consider whether to say more. Between you and me, I think stepping back from your care was really hard for him, but he thought it was the right thing to do. Victoria's throat tightened. Do you think it was the right thing? Dr. Patterson looked at her carefully. I think he was trying to protect you. And maybe protect himself too. Sometimes people follow rules so strictly that they forget to ask why the rules exist in the first place. She handed Victoria her discharge papers. You're not his patient anymore, you know. As of today, you're just a person, and so is he. After Dr. Patterson left, Victoria sat alone in the empty room. She thought about everything she had been through. The accident, the coma, the slow fight back to consciousness, the painful recovery. She thought about Ryan, about his dedication, his kindness, his belief in her when everyone else had given up. She thought about the feelings that hadn't faded despite the distance, despite her attempts to convince herself they weren't real. Maybe they were real. Maybe they had always been real. And maybe it was time to stop being afraid of that. Elena came to pick her up, and as they drove to Victoria's new apartment, Victoria made a decision. She was going to rebuild her life, yes. She was going to start a new business, reconnect with the world, prove that she could stand on her own 2 feet. But once she did that, once she was truly independent and no longer vulnerable, she was going to find Ryan and tell him the truth, that she had feelings for him, that those feelings were real, and that she was willing to fight for them if he was. Life had already taken 3 years from her. She wasn't going to let fear take anything else. But first, she had to prove to herself that she could make it on her own, because if she was going to be with Ryan, she needed to come to him as an equal, not as someone who needed saving. She had spent too long being taken care of. Now it was time to take care of herself. The real journey was just beginning. The first month in her new apartment was harder than Victoria had expected. Everything felt strange and unfamiliar. She would wake up in the middle of the night, confused about where she was, her heart racing as she tried to remember what year it was. The world had changed so much in 3 years, and catching up felt like trying to drink from a fire hose. Technology was different. The apps on her phone were new. Social media had evolved. Even the way people communicated had shifted. Victoria spent hours each day trying to relearn everything, feeling like a time traveler who had jumped forward without a guidebook. But she was determined. Every morning she forced herself out of bed, did her physical therapy exercises, and then sat down at her laptop to work. She started small, reaching out to old contacts in the tech industry, testing the waters to see if anyone remembered her or cared that she was back. The responses were mixed. Some people were genuinely happy to hear from her, excited that she had recovered. Others were polite but distant, clearly having moved on with their lives. A few didn't respond at all. It stung, realizing how quickly the business world had forgotten about her. In tech, 3 years might as well be a lifetime. Victoria's old company had been absorbed by a larger corporation, and most of her innovations had been discontinued or replaced. It was like looking at the ghost of her former life, seeing pieces of what she had built scattered and changed beyond recognition. She had to grieve for that loss before she could move forward. Elena came over for dinner at least twice a week, bringing groceries and company. She watched her sister carefully, worried about how Victoria was handling everything. "Are you okay?" she would ask, and Victoria would always say yes, even when it wasn't entirely true. The truth was, Victoria thought about Ryan every single day. She would see something funny and want to tell him about it. She would have a breakthrough in her physical therapy and instinctively look around for him before remembering he wasn't there. At night, alone in her apartment, she would wonder what he was doing, if he ever thought about her, if he had moved on completely. But she didn't reach out. Not yet. She had made a promise to herself that she would rebuild her independence first, and she was keeping that promise even though it hurt. 3 months after leaving the hospital, Victoria landed her first consulting job. A small startup was developing an app for people with disabilities, and they needed someone with both tech expertise and personal experience. The pay wasn't much, nothing compared to what she used to make, but it felt like a victory. Someone still valued her expertise. She still had something to offer. She threw herself into the project, working long hours from her apartment. The startup's founders were young, barely out of college, and they reminded Victoria of herself 20 years ago. Hungry, ambitious, willing to work crazy hours because they believed in what they were building. She found herself mentoring them, sharing not just her technical knowledge but the business lessons she had learned the hard way. The app launched 4 months later, and it was a success. Not a massive change-the-world success, but a solid, respectable achievement. Victoria felt proud in a way she hadn't felt in years. This was hers. She had built this with her own current abilities, not riding on her past reputation. More consulting offers started coming in. Victoria began building a new professional network, different from the one she had before but just as valuable. She was finding her place in the world again, carving out a new identity that wasn't defined by her past or her accident. Meanwhile, Ryan was struggling. 9 months had passed since he had stepped back from Victoria's care, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He went to work, he treated his patients, he went home to his empty apartment. The routine felt hollow. The nurse he had been dating gently broke things off after 2 months. "Your heart's not in this," she told him kindly. "You're thinking about someone else." Ryan couldn't even deny it. His best friend from medical school, David, came to visit one weekend. They were sitting in Ryan's living room drinking beer and watching a basketball game when David finally confronted him. "All right, what's going on with you? You've been miserable for months." Ryan tried to brush it off, but David wasn't having it. They had been friends for over 10 years, and David could read him too well. Finally, Ryan told him everything. About Victoria, about the 3 years of caring for her, about the feelings that had developed, about walking away because of professional ethics. David listened quietly, then asked a simple question. "Is she still your patient?" "No," Ryan admitted. "She was discharged months ago." "So you walked away from someone you care about, someone who might care about you, because of a rule that doesn't even apply anymore?" When David put it that way, it sounded stupid. Ryan tried to explain about the power dynamics, about how vulnerable Victoria had been, about wanting to do the right thing. But even as he spoke, he realized how much of his decision had been based on fear rather than ethics. He had been scared. Scared of his feelings, scared of being judged, scared of losing his career, scared of getting hurt. "Life's too short, man," David said, shaking his head. "You spent 3 years believing that woman would wake up when everyone else said she wouldn't. You fought for her. And now that she's awake and recovered, you're giving up? That doesn't sound like the Ryan I know." The words hit Ryan hard. David was right. He had fought so hard to bring Victoria back, and then he had run away at the first sign of real connection. What was the point of all that fighting if he was too scared to see where it could lead? But it had been 9 months. Victoria had probably moved on. She was rebuilding her life, and he had no right to walk back into it now. He had made his choice, and she had every right to hate him for it. A week later, Ryan was at the hospital cafeteria getting coffee when he ran into Dr. Patterson. They chatted for a moment, and then she mentioned Victoria, casually. "I saw that article about her new consulting work. She's doing really well. That app for disability assistance won some kind of award." Ryan's heart skipped. "She's working in tech again?" "Oh yes," Dr. Patterson said, smiling. "She's been consulting for several companies. There was a profile about her in Tech Weekly last month. They called her a comeback story. You should read it, you'd be proud." After Dr. Patterson left, Ryan immediately pulled up the article on his phone. There was a photo of Victoria, looking confident and healthy, standing in an office with a team of young developers. The article talked about her recovery, her accident, and her return to the tech world. It mentioned how she was using her experience to help create technology for people with disabilities. Reading about her success filled Ryan with pride, but also with regret. She had done it. She had rebuilt her life without him. She was thriving, moving forward, probably not thinking about him at all anymore. But then he noticed something in one of the quotes. The interviewer had asked Victoria what kept her going during her recovery. Her answer was simple, but it struck him like lightning. "Someone once told me that I was worth fighting for, so I decided to believe him." Ryan read that line over and over. Was she talking about him? Or was he just projecting, seeing what he wanted to see? He didn't know. But what he did know was that he couldn't keep living like this, wondering what if, regretting his choices. He needed to know if there was still a chance, even if the answer was no. Even if she had moved on and didn't want to hear from him. He needed to try. That evening, Ryan sat down and wrote an email. He deleted it and started over about 20 times. How do you reach out to someone after 9 months of silence? How do you explain that you walked away because you were scared, not because you didn't care? Finally, he settled on something simple. He told her he had read the article, that he was proud of everything she had accomplished, that he thought about her often and hoped she was doing well. And then, his heart pounding, he added one more line. "If you'd ever like to get coffee sometime, just as 2 people catching up, I would really like that." He stared at the email for 10 minutes before finally hitting send. Then he closed his laptop, feeling like he might be sick. What if she didn't respond? What if she told him to leave her alone? What if he had just made a complete fool of himself? But at least he had tried. At least he wouldn't spend the rest of his life wondering what could have been. Victoria was working late when the email arrived. She saw Ryan's name in her inbox and froze. For a full minute, she just stared at it, afraid to open it. What if he was writing to tell her he was getting married? What if it was just a formal professional check-in that would break her heart all over again? Finally, she opened it. She read it once, then twice, then a third time. Her hands were shaking. He wanted to see her. After all this time, he wanted to see her. Victoria's first instinct was to respond immediately, but she stopped herself. She had learned patience over these past months. She had learned to think before acting. So instead of responding right away, she sat with the email, letting herself feel everything it stirred up. The next morning, after a mostly sleepless night, Victoria wrote back. Her response was just as simple as his message had been. Coffee sounds nice. I know a place near the park. How about Saturday afternoon? She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Ryan's response came back within an hour. Saturday is perfect, 5 days. In 5 days, Victoria would see Ryan again. And maybe, just maybe, they would finally have the conversation they should have had 9 months ago. Saturday arrived, and Victoria changed her outfit 4 times before finally settling on something casual but nice. Jeans and a sweater, nothing too formal. She wanted to look like she had her life together, not like she had spent the entire week obsessing over this meeting, even though she absolutely had. She arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, then walked around the block twice because she didn't want to seem too eager. When she finally went inside, Ryan was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window. He stood up when he saw her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He looked different. Tired maybe, or older, but his eyes were the same, warm and kind. And when he smiled at her, Victoria felt her heart do that familiar jump it always did around him. "Hi," she said, suddenly feeling shy. "Hi," he replied. "You look great." Really healthy. They sat down, and for a few minutes the conversation was awkward. They talked about the weather, about the coffee shop, about nothing important. Both of them were dancing around what they really wanted to say. Finally, Ryan took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he said, "for disappearing the way I did. I told myself I was doing the right thing, following the rules, protecting you. But the truth is I was scared, and I handled it badly." Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, gathering her courage. "I heard what you told Elena that day, in the hallway. I was there around the corner." Ryan's eyes widened. "You heard that?" She nodded. "Every word. And then you disappeared, and I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to run after you and tell you that I felt the same way. But another part of me was terrified that my feelings weren't real, that I was just confused or grateful or experiencing some kind of psychological thing that happens to patients." "And now?" Ryan asked quietly. "What do you think now?" Victoria met his eyes. "I've had almost a year to figure that out. A year of living independently, rebuilding my career, proving to myself that I can stand on my own. And you know what? The feelings didn't go away. If anything, they got stronger. So yeah, I think they're real." Ryan reached across the table and took her hand. His touch sent electricity through her entire body. "I think about you every day," he said. "I tried not to. I tried to move on. But I can't. You're always there in the back of my mind. When something good happens, I want to tell you. When something goes wrong, I wish you were there. I don't think I realized how much you meant to me until I walked away, and by then it felt too late to come back." "It's not too late," Victoria said softly. They talked for 3 hours in that coffee shop, long after their coffee had gone cold. They talked about everything that had happened over the past year. Victoria told him about her consulting work, about the struggles of adjusting to the new world, about the nights when she felt so lonely she thought she might break. Ryan told her about his work at the hospital, about the patients he couldn't help, about how empty his life had felt without her in it. When the coffee shop started closing, they walked to the park nearby. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat on a bench, and Ryan put his arm around her shoulders. It felt natural, like they had done this 1,000 times before. "So what happens now?" Victoria asked. "I don't know," Ryan admitted. "I want to be with you. But I also want to do this right. No rushing, no questions about whether this is appropriate or ethical. I want everyone, including us, to be sure this is real." Victoria smiled. "Slow sounds good. I've spent the last year learning that not everything has to happen all at once. Some things are worth taking time for." They started seeing each other regularly after that. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates. Dinner dates turned into long walks and movie nights. They took it slow, just like they had promised, getting to know each other as two regular people rather than doctor and patient. Ryan learned things about Victoria that he had never known. Her favorite food was Thai takeout, and she had a weakness for bad action movies. She was terrible at cooking but made incredible homemade ice cream. She snorted when she laughed really hard, and she was self-conscious about it until Ryan told her it was adorable. Victoria learned that Ryan was a morning person who liked to go for runs before sunrise. He played guitar but was too shy to perform in front of people. He had a younger brother he was incredibly close to, and a mother who called him every Sunday without fail. He cried during emotional movies and wasn't ashamed to admit it. They faced challenges. Some of Ryan's colleagues at the hospital raised eyebrows when they found out he was dating a former patient. A few people made comments, questioned whether it was appropriate. Ryan's supervisor called him in for a conversation about it. But since Victoria was no longer his patient and sufficient time had passed, there wasn't actually anything wrong with their relationship. Still, the judgment hurt. Victoria dealt with her own doubts sometimes. On bad days when her body ached from old injuries or when she felt frustrated by her limitations, she would wonder if Ryan only stayed with her out of some misplaced sense of responsibility. Like he had invested so much in saving her that he felt obligated to see it through. But Ryan was patient with her insecurities. He reminded her over and over that he wasn't there out of obligation. He was there because he wanted to be, because she made him laugh, because she challenged him, because being with her felt like coming home. 6 months after their first coffee date, Victoria got a major opportunity. A venture capital firm wanted to invest in a new project she had been developing. An AI system designed to help people with neurological conditions monitor their recovery. It was a chance to start a real company again, not just consult. It was a chance to turn her experience into something that could help others. She asked Ryan to be her medical advisor for the project. It felt right, bringing their stories full circle. The doctor who had saved her life would now help her save others. The company launched on a cold January morning, exactly 1 year after Victoria had been discharged from the hospital. It was a small launch event, nothing fancy, but Victoria was proud. She had done this. She had come back from the impossible and built something new. Ryan was there, of course. He stood in the back of the room during her presentation, watching her with pride in his eyes. When she finished speaking, she looked directly at him and said something that wasn't in her prepared remarks. A few years ago, when I was in the darkest place imaginable, someone believed in me when everyone else had given up. He talked to me when I couldn't respond. He fought for me when it seemed hopeless. He taught me that miracles take time, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to give up. This company exists because of that lesson. After the event, Ryan found her on the building's rooftop terrace. The city stretched out before them, lights twinkling in the darkness. That was quite a speech, he said. I meant every word, Victoria replied. Ryan pulled her close. You know what's funny? I spent 3 years trying to wake you up, and I thought that would be the hard part. But falling in love with you, dealing with all the complications, figuring out how to make this work, that's been so much harder. And so much better. So you love me? Victoria asked, even though she knew the answer. So much it scares me sometimes, Ryan admitted. Good, Victoria said, standing on her toes to kiss him. Because I love you too, and I'm not scared anymore. They stood there together. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. A doctor who had refused to give up, and a woman who had fought her way back to life. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and complicated and real, but it was theirs. Victoria thought about the accident sometimes, about the 3 years she had lost. She wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But standing there with Ryan, building a new company, creating a new life, she realized something. Those years hadn't been wasted. They had led her here, to this moment, to this person, to this life that was different from what she had planned, but somehow better than she could have imagined. What are you thinking about? Ryan asked. I'm thinking that I'm grateful, Victoria said. Not for the accident, not for the pain, but for what came after, for you, for this second chance. Ryan smiled and kissed the top of her head. Second chances are pretty incredible. Yeah, Victoria agreed, looking out at the city lights. They really are. A year later, Ryan proposed to Victoria in that same coffee shop where they had their first official date. It was simple and perfect, just like them. They got married in a small ceremony with close friends and family, including Elena, who cried through the entire thing, and Ryan's mother, who whispered to everyone that she had known from the start they were meant to be together. Victoria's company continued to grow, helping thousands of people with their recovery journeys. Ryan stayed at the hospital, continuing to fight for patients that others had given up on, inspired by the woman who had taught him that miracles were possible. They faced challenges, of course. Life isn't perfect even for people who have beaten incredible odds. But they faced everything together. The doctor who had never given up and the woman who had refused to stay gone. And somewhere in the hospital where their story began, new doctors told new patients about the miracle of Victoria Ashford. Proof that sometimes, against all logic and medical probability, love and determination can bring someone back from the edge of forever. Their story became a reminder that endings can be beginnings, that the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, and that sometimes the person who saves your life is also the person you're meant to spend it with.